Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a modern geopolitical mystery that has literally captivated the globe. We're looking at a superpower, armed to the teeth, that has been locked in a grinding, grueling conflict in Ukraine for years now. And if you've been following the daily news cycle at all, you might be asking yourself, how is a nation with such vast military and nuclear capabilities still fighting this war years later? Is it just a massive operational failure? Or is there a completely different strategic calculus at play here? Something we're missing when we only look at those daily frontline updates. Okay, let's dive into this. It is incredibly easy to get caught up in the minute-by-minute headlines, you know? You see a daily update and you lose sight of the broader picture. But to truly understand what is happening here, we need to step back. We really need to look past the trenches and examine the colossal strategic, economic, and industrial realities driving this protracted conflict. We're going to analyze all of this using data derived straight from our source material, maintaining a completely neutral bird's-eye view of the geopolitics at play. To make sense of this whole situation, we're going to treat this narrative like a matryoshka doll, the Russian nesting dolls. We're going to zoom out layer by layer. We'll cover beyond the Ukrainian frontline, funding the manpower surge, outpacing Western industrial production, awakening Cold War relics, and finally, the geopolitical long game. So let's crack open that first layer, beyond the Ukrainian frontline and the geography of a superpower. You simply cannot understand Russia's military posture without grasping its sheer mind-boggling scale. Think about this. Russia isn't just a country. Geographically, it is essentially the size of a continent. We're talking roughly twice the size of Europe. Look at the stark contrast between the highly localized Ukrainian front line and the actual reality of Russia's borders. They have a 37,000-kilometer northern coastline they have to defend. To the south, a 22,000-kilometer border stretching all the way from Europe to North Korea. So when we talk about the total size of the Russian military, their navy, their air force, we have to remember that only a fraction of those forces are actually deployed in Ukraine. The rest are spread across this massive expanse, guarding literally one of the largest territorial footprints on planet Earth. Moving right along to layer 2, funding the manpower surge, economics over conscription. That geographical reality brings us to human resources. When this conflict began, Russia had roughly 200,000 troops sitting on the Ukrainian border. Today, that number has swelled to over 700,000. But how on earth did they achieve such a massive surge without triggering widespread societal unrest from forced conscription? The answer is pure economics. $10,000. Now, in a lot of Western countries, that might be, a couple of months' rent? But context is absolutely everything here. In Russia, this massive sign-on bonus for joining the military is equivalent to an average citizen's entire annual salary. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how these specific financial incentives completely flip the dynamic of military recruitment. It suddenly becomes this huge economic opportunity. Beyond that initial annual salary sign-on bonus, the military is offering highly lucrative, targeted bounties. If a soldier destroys a Western-supplied tank or downs a Western jet or helicopter, they get these highly publicized cash payouts. And according to our source data, this purely economic strategy is pulling in over 3,000 new recruits every single month. It's quietly and effectively negating the need for highly unpopular mass conscription drafts. Let's open up the third matryoshka doll, outpacing Western industrial production and the unintended consequences of sanctions. With manpower secured, we have to look at the factory floor. When this conflict first escalated, the initial assumption in the West was that severe, unprecedented economic sanctions would essentially bring the Russian economy to its knees, right? The idea was to just halt their war machine entirely. But the data tells a vastly different story. If we compare pre-2022 domestic military production to their current output, Russian military industry hasn't collapsed. It's shifted into absolute overdrive. Tank production has jumped from 100 units a year to 250 units. That's a 2.5 times increase. For advanced fighter jets like the Su-34 and Su-27 and attack helicopters, production has seen a staggering 4-fold increase. So rather than stopping production, these sanctions seemingly forced a massive internal industrial mobilization. And honestly, nowhere is this industrial disparity more obvious than in artillery. As we speak, Russia is churning out between 3.5 and 4 million artillery shells annually. That is a 20-fold increase from their pre-war numbers. Now, compare that to the combined output of all Western nations supporting Ukraine, which currently sits at roughly 1.5 million shells. To put that into perspective, Russia is completely dwarfing the combined industrial output of its geopolitical rivals in this one absolutely crucial metric. Which brings us to Layer 4, Awakening Cold War Relics, the T-72 and the FAB bombs. So, new production is only half the hardware story. For the other half, we need to zoom back in time to the Cold War and look at the hidden advantage left behind by the Soviet Union's old armored warfare doctrine. That doctrine relied on overwhelming armor. Just look at the timeline of the T-72 tank. Introduced back in 1973, it was revolutionary, and they built over 25,000 of them. When the Cold War ended in the 1990s, over 7,000 of these massive machines were essentially sent to cold graves. They were stored out in the freezing expanses of Russia, where pretty much everyone assumed they would just rust away into history. But skip ahead to 2022, and the demand for armor absolutely skyrockets. Today, these dormant beasts are being loaded onto railcars, shipped across the country to factories, and completely overhauled. We're talking 400 to 500 of these tanks being resurrected every single year, gutted, refitted with modern optics and fire control systems, and brought all the way up to the modern T-72B3M standard. And it's not just tanks either. Let's look up at the sky. During the Cold War, the Soviets built thousands upon thousands of aerial bombs. Just consider the sheer, terrifying physics of the FAB-3000. This thing weighs a massive 3 tons. Half of that weight, 1.5 tons, is pure raw explosive material. The concussive force guarantees a literally 100% kill probability within a 150-meter radius. It instantly levels fortified structures. It is so absurdly heavy that only large fighter bombers, like the Su-34, can even carry it. But historically, these were just dumb bombs. You dropped them and you kind of just hoped for the best. And this brilliantly illustrates how modern ingenuity completely transforms warfare. The Russians started attaching what they call glide kits to these old relics. These are relatively cheap, winged, GPS-guided aerodynamic attachments, and they just strap them directly onto these massive, unguided Soviet-era bombs. Suddenly, overnight, a 50-year-old, 3-ton dumb bomb becomes a devastating 21st-century precision weapon. It can glide right to a target and strike a deeply fortified bunker with extreme accuracy, down to a 10-meter margin. This brings us to our final, outermost Matryoshka doll, the geopolitical long game. The irony of fate. So, we've got the geography, the manpower, the industry, and the modernized relics. And that brings us all the way back to our initial question. Why is this conflict still ongoing, and who is actually benefiting from it? Let's look at a critical historical pivot point detailed in our source material. Step 1. Just a month into the conflict, in March 2022, a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine was reportedly nearly finalized. Step 2. That agreement was abandoned after Western leaders allegedly promised extensive financial and military backing, encouraging Ukraine to sustain the fight. Step 3. The strategic calculation in the West was that bogging Russia down in a protracted conflict, combined with crushing sanctions, would cause an economic collapse and potentially trigger a regime change in Moscow. But the outcome has been described by our source as an irony of fate. A strategy meant to break the Russian economy and force a regime change has, instead, seemingly backfired on its original architects, deeply fracturing the unity and resources of NATO. The quagmire meant for Moscow has ensnared the West. So, the crucial point is that the global chessboard has shifted dramatically. The United States is increasingly looking for an exit strategy, as its geopolitical attention pivots toward emerging crises involving Iran and Taiwan. Meanwhile, European nations are out there publicly stating they are depleting their financial and military aid capacities. On top of that, political shifts in the U.S., particularly surrounding figures like Donald Trump, increasingly view NATO as an unsustainable drain on American resources, demanding that Europe defend itself. And through all of this, Russia hasn't collapsed. Instead, it's emerged with a battle-hardened military force that is numerically larger than when the conflict began. When we peel back all the layers of this geopolitical Matryoshka doll, a very clear narrative emerges from the source data. Despite the early assumptions, and despite the overwhelming economic pressure applied by the West, Russia has arguably solidified its status as a great power. And they've done it through domestic industrial mobilization, economic restructuring, and a highly calculated strategy of simply outproducing and outweighting their geopolitical rivals. What looks like a stalemate on the daily news might actually be a long-term strategic success from Moscow's perspective. Which leaves us with a massive, lingering question to think about. As this protracted conflict continues to reshape military production, strain historical alliances, and completely rewrite global economies, What will the new balance of global power actually look like in the next decade? I want to thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. We covered a ton of ground, but there is always more to learn. Keep asking questions, keep looking past the headlines, and I'll see you next time as we continue to explain the complex world around us.